Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. Today, we are jumping into a deep dive on a 19th century blueprint for urban community building that makes a genuinely shocking claim.
It really does. It's a completely counterintuitive premise.
Yeah, because it claims that building more well-funded city hospitals or, expanding massive public welfare nets and even constructing megachurches might actually be making urban poverty and isolation significantly worse.
Right, which forces us to just totally reevaluate how we approach our civic duty today.
Exactly. So we're examining a historical text by Thomas Chalmers. He was a Scottish minister and a political economist, right?
Yes, and the text is titled The Christian and Civic Economy of Large Towns. It was originally printed in Glasgow for William Collins as 3 volumes in one.
Right. And Chalmers was writing this during a period of just explosive, unprecedented urbanization.
He was. And he essentially posited that the very systemic institutional solutions we usually rely on to, save a city are the exact things causing its moral and social decay.
Which is a heavy statement. And to understand the sheer gravity of what Chalmers is arguing here, we kind of have to picture the world he was looking at. I mean, this isn't modern urban planning.
Oh, not at all.
This is 19th century Glasgow during the absolute fever dream of the Industrial Revolution. So you have populations exploding, massive factories churning out smoke everywhere.
Thousands of people pouring in from the countryside looking for work.
Right, and they're being crammed into these incredibly dense, unsanitary tenements. I mean, the wretchedness, the disease, the grueling child labor, the stakes of urban poverty at this time were literally life and death on a massive scale.
Yeah, because the physical environment of the city had transformed way faster than the social infrastructure could handle.
Exactly.
And what Chalmers identified was that the problem wasn't just the physical poverty. It was the complete breakdown of human connection.
Right, the isolation. So the goal of this deep dive is to unpack his really radical thesis on how to handle these seemingly insurmountable problems of rapid urbanization.
Yeah, his core mission was to find a way to take a massive, totally anonymous city like Glasgow, filled with all this industrial chaos, and somehow assimilate it into the intimate, manageable structure of a country parish.
Which sounds completely insane. Making an industrial metropolis feel like a small rural village sounds like an impossible magic trick.
It really does.
But for you listening, whether you're managing a local nonprofit or trying to be a better neighbor, or just trying to wrap your head around why modern cities can feel so isolating despite having millions of people living in them, this text serves as a really fascinating mirror.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
Because Chalmers was looking at a society trying to engineer its way out of poverty. And he saw a fatal flaw in the very people who had taken on the mantle of problem solver.
Right, the people who were supposed to be fixing it.
Exactly. He opens his argument by diagnosing this profound intellectual and practical siloing. He basically observes 2 distinct classes of thinkers and writers attempting to address the chaos.
And who are they?
On one side, you have the political economists, and on the other, the Christian philanthropists. Right. And Chalmers notes they maintain this unfortunate distance from one another.
An unfortunate distance. Okay, let me try to sketch out what that distance looked like on the ground. The political economists in the 19th century, these were the people looking at the macro level data, right?
Right, the big picture.
Yeah, they were studying the wealth of nations, factory outputs, the flow of capital, these grand systemic laws of commerce. They were treating human beings essentially as economic units.
Like inputs in a massive industrial machine.
Exactly. And because they were entirely focused on free trade and systemic machinery, they completely ignored the interior life of the worker. I mean, their religion, their moral habits, their psychological well-being.
Yeah, they viewed the moral framework of a society as completely irrelevant to their spreadsheets.
It's all just numbers to them.
It is. And they actually held a distinct disdain for anyone who prioritized that moral framework. The economists viewed the professional subject of the philanthropist with total unconcern or, honestly, often outright contempt.
Wow, contempt.
Yeah, they saw charity and religious instruction as these sort of sentimental distractions from the hard mathematical realities of supply and demand.
Okay, so that's the economists. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the Christian philanthropists. And these are the people focused intensely on the soul, on morality, on providing ad hoc charity to the suffering individuals right in front of them.
Right, the heart people.
The heart people. But just as the economists ignored the soul, The philanthropists completely ignored political science.
Totally ignored it.
Chalmers points out that they viewed the economists' work with this sensitive kind of prejudice, bordering upon disapprobation and dislike. So they saw all those cold, hard numbers and systemic theories as inherently secular.
Yeah, like it was beneath the holy work of spiritual care.
Right, so they were handing out bread and Bibles without ever pausing to understand the systemic economic forces that made the bread so unaffordably expensive in the first place.
Yes. And the resulting damage of this mutual disdain, in Chalmers' view, was just catastrophic for the city.
Because they wouldn't talk to each other.
Exactly. Because these two camps refused to combine their insights, society was essentially left with two broken tools.
Right.
The political economists ended up producing what he calls inert and unproductive theory. I mean, their grand systemic models might have been intellectually airtight in a university setting, but they completely failed to change actual lives.
Because they ignored human nature.
Because they ignored human nature, yeah, and moral habits and just the relational friction of everyday life.
So if the numbers people produce inert theory, the heart people produce chaos. I mean, Chalmers says the philanthropists, completely lacking an understanding of basic economic and social systems, end up engaging in, well, he calls it well-meaning, but mischievous and ill-directed activity.
Mischievous activity, that's such a great phrase.
It really is. They have all the passion in the world, but their activity is mischievous. And I can picture a modern scenario that maps perfectly onto this.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Imagine a brilliant, highly funded tech startup today. They hired the best data scientists and economists to build this beautifully designed, systemically perfect Civic app, right? To help a struggling neighborhood distribute resources.
Okay, I see where this is going.
But they never actually go to the neighborhood. They never talk to the community leaders. They don't understand the cultural or moral fabric of the people living there. So the app launches and completely flops. No one uses it.
It is entirely inert theory.
Exactly. And then, on the flip side, imagine a passionate grassroots volunteer group. They love their community deeply. They're out on the streets every day, but they completely misunderstand basic economic principles.
Right.
So they set up a free clothing distribution program that accidentally bankrupts the only 3 local clothing shops in the neighborhood.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Destroying local jobs and creating a long-term cycle of dependency, all because they didn't look at the systemic outcomes of their charity. They mean well, but their activity is mischievous.
That's a perfect modern parallel.
Mm-hmm.
And Chalmers believed that bridging this exact divide, combining the systemic understanding of the economist with the moral and relational drive of the philanthropist, was literally the only way to save the city.
Because if you don't...
Because if you keep them separate, society ends up with the horrifying paradox he observed on the streets of Glasgow.
What was the paradox?
He pointed out a steady progress of wretchedness despite the proliferation of charitable institutions, and a steady progress of profligacy, or, reckless immorality, despite the building of grand churches and Sabbath schools.
Wow. A steady progress of wretchedness despite the charities. That observation is a massive red flag for anyone working in the nonprofit or civic sector today.
It really is. You build more charities, but poverty deepens.
You build more churches, but the social fabric still decays. It's because the structural approaches are divorced from human nature. For you listening, think about the tension you might have experienced in your own professional or volunteer life. That friction between the board members looking at the quarterly budget and the frontline workers dealing with human trauma. Chalmers is arguing that if those two groups don't synthesize their approaches, the entire endeavor just collapses.
Yes. And since generalized money and generalized preaching were failing to turn the tide, Chalmers realized he needed a totally new structural approach to unite the systemic and the personal.
He had to change the scale.
Right. He needed to shrink the chaotic, massive city down to a human scale. And his proposal for doing this is what he termed the principle of locality.
The principle of locality. Okay, let's unpack this. If the city is too big and generalized efforts are diluted, the only logical move is to basically carve the city up.
Yes. This is where he introduces the idea of assimilating a town to a country parish.
Right. Because in a 19th century rural Scottish parish, the geographic boundaries were really tight.
Very tight.
The minister, the local leaders, the teachers, they intimately knew every single family. They knew the generational history. They knew who was struggling with alcohol. They knew whose crops failed. They knew the specific temperament of every child.
The social safety net was literally woven out of deep inescapable personal knowledge.
Contrast that rural intimacy with Chalmers' description of the city. He calls the urban population a massive, unchecked medley.
Medley.
Yeah, a chaotic mixture where the sheer volume of humanity provides this cloak of anonymity. When a city minister or a civic leader tries to serve the entire city as a whole, their efforts are scattered across thousands of random, disconnected interactions.
Right. They're simply responding to whoever happens to show up at their door or whoever happens to apply for their funds.
And Chalmers argues this passive citywide approach is fundamentally flawed.
It's completely broken. To combat this medley, he calls for a numerous and well-appointed agency of individuals. And the critical piece of the puzzle here is that they must be assigned to specific hyperlocal territories.
So you don't get the whole city of Glasgow.
No. You get these 3 specific streets. You get this one block of tenements.
Right.
And you don't set up an office and wait for the people in those 3 streets to come to you for help or instruction. Chalmers introduces the concept of an aggressive movement.
Aggressive movement.
He states plainly that you cannot wait for the city's inhabitants to demand religious or moral instruction.
Yeah.
You must go to them.
I think we need to contextualize that word aggressive, though.
Oh, absolutely.
Because its connotation has shifted significantly. In modern parlance, aggressive implies hostility, combativeness, or like an unwelcome intrusion.
Right, but in Chalmers' framework, he means proactive. He is contrasting it with a stationary, passive approach where an institution simply builds a grand edifice and just, hopes the marginalized population finds the motivation to walk through the doors.
Yeah, he identifies a moral distance in the city that is just as real and just as difficult to cross as physical distance.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Because a family living in deep poverty might physically reside only 50 feet from a beautiful church or a civic center, but the moral distance, the alienation, the overwhelming class divides, the deep-seated resentment, it makes that building feel like it exists in a completely different universe.
Exactly. Therefore, these local agents, by actively crossing that street and knocking on that tenement door, they are effectively operating as missionaries without ever leaving their own hometown.
And Sabbath schools served as his prime example of this locomotive tactic, didn't they?
They did. At the time, there was notable pushback against Sabbath schools from various establishment figures, but Chalmers fiercely defended them.
Why?
Because they targeted what he termed unobserved heathenism. Instead of waiting for children from neglected, severely impoverished families to somehow acquire the clean clothes, the social confidence, and the motivation to walk into a formal church setting, the Sabbath school teachers moved directly into those specific neglected neighborhoods.
They rented rooms in the slums.
Yes, they rented rooms. They established a localized, inescapable presence to proactively bridge that moral distance.
He calls this a locomotive influence. You are bringing the care to the sluggish, stationary families. It's not about building a bigger, shinier magnet and hoping it pulls people out of their isolation. It's about putting the magnet in your pocket and walking into their living room.
That's a perfect visualization.
But I have to wonder about the practical mechanics of this. What does this aggressive movement actually look like for the everyday agent walking into a tenement? I mean, if I just aggressively stand near someone, society doesn't magically fix itself.
Right.
Simple proximity can't be the entire strategy.
No, proximity is merely the prerequisite for the actual work. Once the local agent is embedded in their specific territory, the tactics become deeply relational.
Okay, so what are they doing?
Well, Chalmers emphasizes that the work relies on the simple elements of attention and advice and civility and goodwill. He acutely observed that in a large manufacturing city, a toxic resentment festers between the high and the low.
Between the wealthy, educated classes and the laboring, impoverished classes.
Exactly. They view each other as hostile caricatures. They are mutually blind to the humanity of the other.
Yeah, the wealthy see the poor as a dangerous, chaotic mob, and the poor see the wealthy as aloof, greedy oppressors. And the only way to shatter those caricatures is sustained, face-to-face interaction over time.
Precisely. When an agent who is often someone slightly more elevated in rank or education or resources goes into the tenements, they must not enter as an aloof administrator carrying a clipboard.
Right, they can't be a bureaucrat.
No. By offering consistent attention, asking about their children, showing basic civility, they dissolve that class defiance. Chalmers believed this interaction creates a patriarchal relationship.
Ooh, patriarchal.
Yeah, and again, we must read that term through a 19th century lens. He meant a relationship of protective, familial care and mutual respect, rather than the modern connotation of oppressive control.
Right. So this aggressive movement is truly an aggression against isolation itself. They are actively pursuing a relationship to knit the social fabric back together.
Exactly.
But this raises a really fascinating question about the ultimate goal of all this relationship building. If these local agents are aggressively moving into neighborhoods and teaching in Sabbath schools, what exactly are they achieving on a macro scale?
Right.
Because Chalmers makes a very sharp and very crucial distinction between two types of good that result from this localized system: Christian good and civic good.
And this distinction is arguably one of the most brilliant and pragmatic elements of his entire thesis.
Really? How so?
Well, Chalmers, as an ordained clergyman, obviously holds the spiritual salvation of individuals as his highest priority. He defines Christian good as the work of reclaiming a select few from the love of the world to the spiritual services of God.
Right. So this is the realm of profound personal conversion, deep piety, and ultimate salvation.
Yes. However, he is remarkably clear-eyed about the statistical realities of this work.
What do you mean?
He openly admits that a minister, even working tirelessly in a hyperlocal district, might only achieve this pure Christian good for a tiny fraction of the population.
Like how small?
Perhaps tens or 50s in a teeming city parish of thousands.
Wow. If you're a religious leader and your only metric for success is profound spiritual conversion, reaching only 50 people out of thousands might feel like a massive failure.
It would. But this is where Chalmers introduces the concept of collateral benefit. He calls this the civic good.
The civic good. And he defines civic good as the work of reclaiming thousands of people from profligacy, from chaotic and destructive living, to a state of quiet, manageable citizenship.
Exactly. The habits instilled by the presence of these local agents in Sabbath schools, habits of sobriety, basic frugality, respect for neighbors, and a renewed sense of family duty, these become the cultural byproducts of the moral and spiritual teachings.
Even if they don't convert.
Right. Even if the vast majority of the neighborhood never experiences a profound theological awakening, they absorb the cultural and moral norms being modeled right in their living rooms. They become better, more stable citizens simply through the osmosis of these consistent, civilizing interactions.
I think of it like planting a highly specialized community garden in the middle of a blighted, abandoned city lot.
Okay, I like this.
So the primary stated goal of the garden organizers, let's call this the Christian good in the analogy, is to teach the neighborhood the deep, complex science of botany and sustainable agriculture.
Right.
Now, maybe only 5 people in a neighborhood of 5,000 actually dedicate themselves to learning the heavy science. Only 5 people become master botanists.
Which is the Christian good.
Exactly. Yeah. But the civic good is the massive wave of collateral benefits that wash over the rest of the neighborhood. Because the lot is cleaned up and activated, the local crime rate drops. The air quality gets marginally better. There is a beautiful visual amenity that lifts the psychological mood of the street. Neighbors who previously ignored each other start saying hello across the tomato plants.
Yes.
You don't have to understand a single thing about the science of botany to benefit profoundly from the civic tranquility that the garden brings to your block.
The utility of that analogy is exactly how Chalmers leveraged this reality to appeal directly to the secular authorities.
Oh, so?
He's speaking directly to the municipal magistrates, the city planners, and the politicians of Glasgow. These are men who are likely overwhelmed by riots, skyrocketing crime rates, overflowing poorhouses, and collapsing public sanitation.
Right. They might not care at all about theology or the spiritual state of the laboring class. They just want the city to stop bleeding money and the citizens to stop breaking windows.
Exactly. So Chalmers essentially looks these secular leaders in the eye and says, even if you are a mere secular philanthropist or a civic ruler whose only demand is for quiet citizens rather than holy and regenerated believers, you should be pouring your resources into supporting this localized ecclesiastical system.
You should be backing these local agents.
Yes. Why? Because even if the system only saves the souls of a few, it is the most efficient, powerful tool in existence for humanizing a massive, unruly population and achieving the civic peace you so desperately want.
He is pitching his spiritual infrastructure as the ultimate civic hack.
He really is.
By breaking the city down into these local jurisdictions and deploying agents to build relationships, he argues you divide and weaken the force of popular violence.
It's incredibly pragmatic.
And for you, the listener, think about the institutions anchoring your own community right now.
Right.
There might be a religious community center, a cultural organization, or a local nonprofit whose core philosophical beliefs you don't personally share. But when you look at their secondary impacts, the kids they keep off the streets after school, the meals they provide to the elderly, the informal neighborhood watch their presence, creates, you have to appreciate the profound civic tranquility they generate.
Absolutely.
Chalmers is urging society to recognize and leverage the value of that civic good, regardless of where they stand on the Christian good.
But if this localized system of agents is so incredibly effective at creating civic good and humanizing the population, we must ask how it handles the ultimate, most difficult civic problem of all.
Extreme poverty.
Yes, extreme poverty. How does a localized network of volunteers handle a family that is literally starving?
Right.
This brings us to what is undoubtedly the most controversial, provocative, and fiercely debated territory of Chalmers' entire text.
Okay, wait, before we dive into his views on poverty, I just want to pause and make something absolutely clear to you listening.
Yes, please do.
The historical sources we are exploring right now, they contain highly charged ideological viewpoints regarding public welfare, poverty, and government taxation. Chalmers is going to make some extreme arguments.
Very extreme.
And we're going to unpack these arguments in detail because they are historically significant and intellectually fascinating, but neither I nor the expert are taking sides or endorsing these views. We are strictly here to report and analyze the historical arguments presented in this 19th century text.
Exactly. We are exploring his perspective and his historical context, not advocating for his ideas as modern social policy.
Thank you. Okay, so with that boundary set, what is his attack?
Well, Chalmers mounts an incredibly fierce, almost scorched earth attack on what he calls modern pauperism and the charity of law.
The charity of law. To understand his attack, we must define that term. In his era, this referred to publicly funded, legalized welfare systems supported by mandatory government taxes, which were known at the time as poor rates. Wait, before we go further, what exactly were poor rates? Was this like a modern income tax that went into a general fund?
Not quite. Poor rates were property taxes levied on parishes or municipalities specifically for the relief of the poor. If you owned a certain amount of property, you were legally mandated to pay this tax, and the funds were then distributed by civic administrators to those who could prove their destitution.
So it was the early foundation of institutionalized welfare.
Yes, it was.
And Chalmers absolutely despised it.
Oh, you hate it.
He does not hold back in his writing. He states that public charity, the charity of law, is a superstructure altogether raised on the basis of imposture and worthlessness.
Imposture and worthlessness.
Those are strong words. He believes that the moment charity becomes an institutionalized legal right funded by taxes, it becomes entirely artificial. And the psychological effects of that artificiality, according to him, are catastrophic for the very people it is supposed to help.
Because his argument hinges on the psychological concept of recoil.
Recoil.
Yeah. He posits that in a natural state of human interaction, an individual feels a certain delicacy, a natural hesitation or shame about exposing their absolute destitution to a peer or a neighbor.
Right. It's hard to ask for help.
Exactly. But when the state sets up a massive, faceless institution that publicly advertises funds for the poor, that natural barrier of delicacy is forced open. The recoil is overborne.
Because it's an institution, not a person.
Right. And once that shame is bypassed by an institutional promise, he argues, deceit and selfishness become perpetual, entrenched elements in the relationship between the poor and the state. It devolves into a game of proving just how destitute you are in order to extract the funds.
Okay, I have to push back on this because from a modern perspective, this sounds incredibly harsh.
It does.
It sounds like he's assuming that providing a safety net automatically turns people into greedy manipulators. Is he actually arguing that a well-funded city hospital or a legal welfare net is worse for a starving family than leaving them to fend for themselves? It sounds like he's saying let them starve so they don't lose their delicacy.
I know it sounds cruel to our modern ears. But it is essential to understand the structural alternative he envisions to see why he genuinely believed his approach was compassionate, not cruel.
Okay, what's the alternative?
Chalmers is absolutely not advocating for abandoning the poor to starvation. What he is fiercely advocating for is transferring the care of the poor from a bureaucratic system back to a relational system,
So he wants to tear down the charity of law.
because he believes it is actively destroying something vastly superior,
Yeah.
what he calls the charity of nature and spontaneous charity.
The charity of nature, meaning human beings naturally stepping up to care for one another when a crisis hits.
Precisely. His core thesis here is deeply psychological and economic. He argues that massive public funds act as a barrier to genuine human compassion. He believes that institutional charity actively misleads everyone involved in the social contract.
Misleads them how?
Well, first, it misleads the poor away from their own personal economy and frugality. If they believe the state will catch them, they are less likely to save or prepare for hard times.
Okay.
Second, it misleads families from their natural duties. A son might feel less urgency to care for his aging, sick mother because he assumes the parish poorhouse is legally obligated to do it.
Oh, wow.
And third, it misleads the rich from genuine sympathy. The wealthy property owner pays his mandatory poor rates, and because he has paid his tax, he feels he has fully outsourced his moral obligation to the poor.
It is the ultimate outsourcing of empathy.
Exactly.
He's saying that when the government forces you to pay for charity through taxes, you wash your hands of your neighbor. You say, I gave it the office, I paid my poor rates, the guy sleeping on the street isn't my personal problem anymore, he's the city's problem.
Right.
And the city, being a massive faceless bureaucracy, treats that man like a number on a ledger. The human connection is completely severed on both ends of the economic spectrum.
Yes. He explicitly writes that a legal provision for human want actually abridges and diminishes the supply of care that would otherwise naturally flow from other quarters.
He really believed that.
He held a profound, perhaps idealistic belief that if you removed the artificial legal system, the natural kindness of neighbors, the fierce dedication of extended family members, and the spontaneous generosity of the wealthy would immediately rush in to fill the void.
And they would do so with much more warmth, efficiency, and dignity than a government clerk ever could.
That was his argument, yes.
Which is a massive leap of faith regarding human nature. I mean, if we tear down the public charity system, as Chalmers suggests, what exactly replaces it? How do you prevent mass misery and starvation on a practical level while you wait for this charity of nature to kick in?
It's a fair question. And this isn't just a theoretical debate for him. He actually put this into practice. He managed to test his theory in the parish of St. John's in Glasgow.
The St. John's experiment.
Yes, it is the practical crucible of his entire theory. Chalmers managed to convince the civic authorities of Glasgow to grant his specific parish unfettered discretion over their poor.
Wait, they let him do it?
They did. He effectively severed his parish from the city's general tax-funded poor relief system. Instead of drawing from the mandatory poor rates, his parish operated on a small, entirely separate, and highly restricted revenue.
Where did it come from?
A Sabbath offering collected voluntarily at the church doors.
A voluntary offering instead of a mandatory tax. Wow. The budget for helping the poor must have shrunk exponentially overnight.
It did.
So the people managing this money are those localized agents we talked about earlier. In the text, he refers to the Kirk sessions managing this. For those of us not brushed up on 19th century Scottish church governance, what exactly is a Kirk session?
A Kirk session is the lowest local governing body of a Scottish Presbyterian church. It's typically made up of the local minister and a group of elected laymen known as elders.
Okay, elders.
In Chalmers' system, these elders were the local agents assigned to those specific small territorial blocks we discussed.
So, an elder is suddenly responsible for the poverty in his specific 3 blocks, but his budget is tiny compared to the old city funds. If he can't just write a check from a massive public fund, how does he handle a family in crisis?
The elder's role completely shifts from what it would be under the public system. Under the charity of law, the civic administrator is essentially an almoner.
An almoner, meaning an official whose sole job is the distribution of alms or cash to the poor.
Exactly. The almoner just checks the qualifications and dispenses the cash. But in Chalmers' system, the elder is primarily a visitor, a counselor, and an investigator.
An investigator.
Yeah, when someone approaches the elder for help, the elder doesn't just hand over a portion of the Sabbath offering. They offer a courteous reception, they sit down with the family, they listen patiently, and then they investigate the reality of the situation.
If they only have a tiny voluntary Sabbath offering, I imagine they couldn't operate like an ATM.
No, not at all.
The elder must have had to act more like an auditor or a financial counselor. What exactly were they investigating when they went into the home?
They are looking to see if the family truly has exhausted all other natural options before turning to the institutional church funds. And this is where Chalmers describes the elder offering a meek and moral and affectionate remonstrance against expensive habits.
A meek and moral remonstrance.
Yes.
So the elder sits at the kitchen table, looks at their budget, and says, I see you are struggling to buy bread for the children, but you are spending a portion of your wages on alcohol or tobacco or other expensive habits. We need to fix your personal frugality and reallocate your own resources before we even consider dipping into the parish funds.
Furthermore, the elder vigorously investigates the family network. They will ask, can the older children support the aging parents? Is there an extended cousin or an uncle who can provide a temporary loan? Can the neighbors pool resources to help them through this specific illness?
They're trying to activate the charity of nature.
Exactly. The ultimate goal of the elder is not to distribute money, but to teach frugality, to urge families to support their own kin, and to save the individual from the degradation of needing to rely on parish charity at all.
The degradation.
Yeah, Chalmers deeply believed that keeping someone off the charity rolls was the highest, most respectful service you could render them, because it preserved their independence and their dignity.
Now, Chalmers himself notes in the text that this intense investigative approach was frequently accused of cold-blooded severity.
Oh, absolutely.
And you can completely see why. I mean, imagine a desperate person coming to an institution for help, and the elder says, well, let's scrutinize your spending habits and have you ask your cousin for a loan. It sounds incredibly austere, almost punitive.
It does.
But Chalmers insists that this process, in reality, results in a kindlier spirit throughout the neighborhood and a population that is less hard-favored. How on earth does he justify that? How does severely restricting access to funds and saying no to public money actually make a community kinder?
He justifies it by deeply analyzing the psychological dynamics of the transaction.
Okay.
When you have a massive public tax-funded pool of money, the poor approach that fund with the imagination of a right.
The imagination of a right.
Yes, they feel legally entitled to it. And when the almoner or administrator hesitates, investigates, or denies them, it breeds deep, immediate resentment and anger. It is an inherently adversarial relationship.
The administrator is trying to protect the state's funds. The applicant is trying to extract them.
Exactly.
It's like going to the DMV or fighting with a massive insurance bureaucracy today. The interaction is inherently frustrating, defensive, and completely impersonal.
But by entirely removing the imagination of a right, because the Sabbath offering is clearly understood to be a highly limited, voluntary gift of charity rather than a legal entitlement, Chalmers argues that the native temperament of love and liberty is restored to the interaction.
Interesting.
The elder isn't a government bureaucrat guarding a vault. He is a neighbor sitting in your home trying to help you figure out a sustainable path forward.
So if the elder does ultimately give you funds from the church, it is received with genuine gratitude because it is recognized as a gift, not a right. And if the elder instead helps you find employment or reconnects you with an estranged family member who can help, you maintain your dignity.
Yes. He argues that this localized system forces the rich and poor to actually interact as human beings.
They can't avoid each other.
Exactly. In these personal home-based interviews, the massive inequalities of condition are momentarily forgotten. The wealthy elder sits in the humble tenement. He physically sees the living conditions. He understands the actual nuanced struggles of the family. And true, spontaneous sympathy flourishes.
It ceases to be a sterile financial transaction. It becomes a transformation of the community fabric.
We must also note that Chalmers claimed his experiment at St. John's was a massive empirical success.
Did it work?
He recorded that they managed the poverty of the entire district at a mere fraction of the cost of the surrounding public systems.
Wow.
More importantly, he argued that the poor in his district were actually better cared for not by the church funds, but by the newly stimulated economy of their own families and the revitalized spontaneous charity of their neighbors.
So the charity of nature really did kick in.
According to him, yes. He believed he had definitively proven that human indigence could be safely and fully confided to the sympathy of individuals rather than the machinery of the state.
It is such a profound, unsettling challenge to how we operate our civic lives today.
It is.
For you listening, just reflect on how we give right now. We have almost entirely automated our charity. We pay our taxes, a portion of which goes to massive social safety net programs.
Right.
Or we set up a $20 monthly digital donation on our credit card to a highly efficient global nonprofit, and we never have to think about it again. We don't have to look poverty in the eye. We are incredibly efficient.
Very efficient.
But does automating our charity detach us from the actual human connection that Chalmers insists is the real cure for societal decay? Are we perfectly balancing the municipal spreadsheet but inadvertently starving the soul of the community?
It is a question that cuts to the very core of modern civic life. Has we traded the messy, emotionally taxing, time-consuming, but deeply humanizing work of local, face-to-face relationships for the sterile, bureaucratic efficiency of systemic institutions?
Wow. So if generalized preaching fails because it's diluted, Chalmers must have realized he needed a way to shrink the city. We've traced his incredible journey to do just that today.
We really have.
We started with his diagnosis of the great disconnect, right? The political economists with their macro-systemic numbers and the Christian philanthropists with their moral hearts completely failing to communicate and thereby making the city worse.
Yes. And from there, we explored his structural solution.
Yeah.
The principle of locality.
Right.
The aggressive, proactive movement of local agents crossing the moral distance to shrink the chaotic, anonymous city down to the intimate scale of a knowable country parish.
And we unpacked the surprising pragmatism of this localized approach. How the pursuit of Christian good and spiritual salvation for a few inevitably produces a massive wave of civic good for the many, creating quiet, manageable citizens and humanizing the neighborhood in ways that secular leaders must appreciate.
And finally, we waded into his incredibly intense, controversial argument against institutional tax-funded welfare.
The charity of law.
Exactly. We examined his belief that the legal charity of law actively destroys the natural charity of nature, and his insistence that true dignified care requires interpersonal friction, localized investigation, and spontaneous human sympathy rather than a blind check from a bureaucratic office.
If we synthesize Chalmers' The Christian and Civic Economy of Large Towns, it is essentially a sustained, passionate, deeply historical argument that systemic problems cannot be solved by systemic, impersonal mechanisms.
Right.
They can only be solved by intensely local, deeply personal relationships. The massive framework of the city must be intentionally broken down to the scale of human intimacy. In our hyper-connected modern world, we possess systemic reach that Chalmers couldn't have even dreamed of. I mean, we can pull out a smartphone and instantly send money to alleviate a tragedy halfway across the globe.
Yeah, in seconds.
But at the exact same time, we often don't know the name of the person living on the other side of our own apartment wall.
Yeah.
We don't know the neighbor walking past us on the street.
It's a real paradox.
So I want to leave you with this provocative thought to mull over. If Thomas Chalmers is right, if he is fundamentally correct, that institutional funding and massive bureaucratic structures can never replace the delicate, messy, but absolutely necessary charity of nature and human connection, are our modern, massive systems of civic support actually preventing us from building the real, localized communities we are so desperately craving? Are the very institutional systems designed to save the city the exact things keeping us isolated in the dark? Think about that next time you walk through your own neighborhood.